Well, hey everyone, Andy Serwich here with Hornet Security, coming at you with a follow-up video to a webinar that we did on Windows Server Storage. So with me, I've got a good friend of mine, Didier Van Hoy. How's it going, my friend?
Just fine, thank you.
Hey, good to have you here. We did a webinar, I think it was 2 weeks back, week and a half back now, basically about everything in the Windows Server Storage world. And as you can imagine, that encompasses a lot of stuff, right? I mean, we got S2D, we've got Azure Stack HCI, we've got P memory, or persistent memory. We've got ReFS, NTFS. I mean, way more than you can talk about in a single webinar, right? And I mean, with that, we got just a load of fantastic questions in the 2 sessions that we did. And, we always like to do some sort of follow-up video like this that's, one, we cover some of the really good questions that we got and maybe answered in the webinar. We also want to make sure that we cover the questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. So I don't know, what do you think, Didier? Should we just kind of dive right in here?
Yeah, sure, why not?
All right. So just kind of diving right into the list here, I think one of the first things that came up, when we were talking about ReFS, ReFS being the resilient file system, the kind of the new kid on the block in terms of file systems in the Microsoft stack, right? One of the questions that came up was like, hey, are permissions with ReFS, are they any different from NTFS permissions? And, dealing with permissions on ReFS is exactly the same as NTFS, right?
From your perspective, yeah, sure it is. I mean, I haven't noticed any difference.
Yeah, same.
And of course, due to the use cases that we actually leverage ReFS for, you will probably not run into the typical permissions issues you might see with user data being stored on a 100 terabyte SAN, where you have a history of 25 years of people changing permissions, adding groups. So normally ReFS permissions, in my experience, are simpler and cleaner than you could find in the NTFS world, right? But
Yeah.
just due to the use case.
Right. I think of those file shares, like you said, have been around for 20 years. And it's like, they're 40 folders deep and, inherent permissions halfway down. And it's just a rat's nest to sort, right? So
I migrated a lot of those, and I was, let's say I gained way too much experience in dealing with that.
Right. Enough for one lifetime, right? So
yeah.
All right, so I think that covers that question. Next one we had, we talked a lot about storage spaces direct in the webinar, and I actually did just a real brief kind of 10,000 foot view management type of demo using my own S2D lab that sits in the room beneath me in the basement. And basically we had a lot of questions about like, hey, what are you running in that lab? And you kind of, not only that question, but centered around more the question of, hey, I want to set up my own lab. What's kind of the minimum specs that I need? And, when I look at that question personally, I kind of, I would say that what I'm running in my lab is kind of the minimum level required for learning S2D. So I'm going to do a more comprehensive video on exactly these are the part numbers, these are the components, but at a high level, what my lab consists of, it's a 2-node lab. They're both custom build nodes using Supermicro motherboards. It's got a 6-core, I forget what generation, Xeon processor in each of them. Yeah, I forget the exact generation. Again, I'm gonna have to do a more specific teardown on it. But they're 6-core Xeon processors. Each node has 32 gigs of memory, and then in terms of storage, each node has 4 1 terabyte hard drives and 2 400 gig NVMe devices. So in my particular configuration, a 2-node S2D cluster, each cluster uses the NVMe devices as read-write cache, and then those 4 1 terabyte devices are used for long-term storage. Now, on top of that, I also have a single 250 gig SSD in each node that's where the OS lives, right? So basically, that's kind of how the basic storage and compute teardown is. In terms of networking, each node has a quad port i350 Intel NIC, so it's a quad port NIC, 1 gig cards, right? Very basic. But then I also went out and I bought, it's an oldie but a goodie, and that is a Mellanox ConnectX 3. I'm actually getting 40 gig traffic between the two nodes using a direct connect between the two ConnectX 3s. So again, it's an older card, but for a home lab like this, I'm actually getting really good performance out of it. I've been pretty happy with the RDMA over that particular connection and the speeds I'm getting. So, having all of those components really lets you experience and manage, kind of everything that S2D has to offer, right? You're handling the network layer, the storage layer. I wish I had a little bit more memory, but maybe that's a couple months from now I'll add a little bit more memory into my particular setup. But I don't know, Didier, kind of what are your thoughts? Like I said, I kind of see that as kind of like the minimum entry level for really learning S2D, right?
If you want to do S2D or Azure Stack HCI, I mean, that's the minimum because, I mean, that's just the nature of software-defined storage. You're going to have some bandwidth and some compute power and some memory to make it all work.
Yep.
And you might be able to do it on a couple of VMs and it will work, but it's going to be slow and it's not going to give you the same experience. So it depends a bit what you want to do. Do you just want to have a look-see to see what is it and how do you set it up?
Yep.
Do it in a virtual machine. Okay, it's going to be beefy virtual machines, but you can do it.
Yep.
But if you're like, really, I'm into storage and I need to learn about this and I have a deep interest in this stuff, well, what you just suggested is the way to go, of course.
Right.
Because the other routes, buying, let's say, vendor solutions, it's quite expensive, comes with support and stuff like that. So if you want to learn, you probably don't need it. The only thing to watch out for is grab the hardware components that are on the HCL list so that you can have, let's say, reasonable success without needing support.
Yes.
Of course, if you buy an OEM solution, everything should be verified and there will be support for it. But in the lab, you mitigate that cost and you just have to make sure. Don't go where no one has ever boldly gone before, whatever the saying is, in your lab with software-defined storage, because I know it's software-defined storage, but hardware and firmware still matter.
It does.
They're quite important. So.
Yep. I was very fortunate that I didn't run into any what I would call firmware shenanigans. Like, I mean, everything pretty much worked right out of the box, right? So I was lucky in that regard. But yes, fantastic advice. That's not a good place to be, having to deal with firmware bugs and everything. So good advice there. Speaking of labs, the other thing that came up during your persistent memory, the section that you did on persistent memory in that webinar was like, hey, you're getting 1.5 million IOPS with very little latency. Like, I remember, like, the first time you showed me that, I'm like counting zeros because I'm like, I think that's 1.5 million, but like, that can't be 1.5. No, it was 1.5 million IOPS. Can you kind of explain a little bit what that lab looked like, just so people kind of understand what that hardware you were using to achieve those kind of numbers?
Well, particularly there were Dell servers, 2 units, the R740 series, and basically they had to be used for SQL Server virtualization, and the DBAs had been struggling with IOPS and latency with certain workloads for a very limited number of virtualized SQL servers. And the question was, well, do you need high availability? Do you need live migration? What's the deal here, right?
Right.
And as it turns out, they could live without live migration. And as it was SQL and it was all log based, let's give PMEM with direct access a go with the SQL Server installation. That was a bit of an experiment. Right? They didn't need that huge amount of storage, but they needed performance. So the cheapest way for us to do that was actually get the NVDIMN, right? So, which is basically memory. So it's very, very fast, but it's limited in capacity. So we interleaved them and we started playing with those. Now, part of the deal of helping out those DBAs was like, can I grab the machine for a couple of other tests? And,
Right.
and I was like, okay, fine. And I had a blast for about a week in the evenings, just looking what it can do.
Right.
And of course, unfortunately, you have to give those things back. So
So you blew the doors off your lab
yeah,
running
basic,
those
yeah, yeah,
running
yeah.
those tests.
And they ended up serving a couple of SQL Server VMs that had that particular need.
Man, that's
Uh,
just, you think
that,
about where we came from 10 years ago, right? I mean,
yeah, it's
just those
unbelievable.
numbers are
It's unbelievable.
insane.
But that's the point. I mean, the moment you start playing with persistent memory, and it's only going to get worse or better depending on how you want to look at it. But
Right.
the all our software stacks have been designed to deal with the limitations of hardware.
Right.
Everything caches, the hardware caches, the OS caches, the file system caches, the applications cache. Everybody is caching. And at
Right.
a given moment, somebody comes up with memory, speeds, and storage, and all of a sudden, all those caches are holding you back. So everybody has to, well, you still have to deal with all the storage that has a benefit from the caching, but now you also have to make sure, look, if somebody starts putting PMEM in the server, they want to have a good experience and don't want to hear, well, that's nice for you, but we can't use it because, you know, our software, whatever layer it is, isn't built for it. So there's a challenge there as well, actually.
Right.
Uh, and
Definitely.
that's only going to get worse, right? But that's
Right.
first world problems, of course, I have to admit.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. So I'm glad we could kind of talk about that a little bit, because a lot of people were asking that when they started seeing the numbers. I'm sure people were doing the same thing I was and counting zeros, right? To
Yeah, I was counting zeros too the first time. I was like,
yep,
nah, that can't be true. Yep.
right. And then you run it again and see, oh yeah, I guess that is true. Anyway,
Yeah, and then you achieve 1.7 at a given moment. Then you stop because you're like, it's one. You know you're gonna have to give it back, and once you've seen that, you're kind of spoiled.
right, right. They got to pry it out of your cold dead hands to get it back, right?
Yep.
So
And if you're into storage, the latency was 0.0, right? I mean, like
right, just absolutely
ridiculous.
insane.
That's
Anyway,
geeking out. Yeah.
yep. I guess let's move on to our next question here, and that was kind of got an interesting question here about ceph. So CEPH,
Yeah.
which is like an I guess I would equate it. It's like an open source S2D, right? Is basically what it is. Open source software to find storage, basically. And the question was, hey, is ceph on Hyper-V supported? So, I mean, that question is very broad. Like, okay, how are we talking about ceph on Hyper-V? But, I know one of the traditional use cases was like, hey, if you've already got ceph in your environment and you've got a Hyper-V cluster that you want to host the VMs on the ceph storage and present it using iSCSI to Hyper-V, you can do that. But I think you've actually come up with some new information on that particular
Yeah.
area, right, Didier?
I mean, Ceph came up a couple of years ago because it was a bit in the spotlight, I guess. People started using it more. But the answer was always no, not really, or you need to build your own driver, as if everybody can do that, or use some
Right.
niche project you might find and get to work, whatever. But this year, that was something that didn't go by unnoticed. Somebody built a native solution to use Cephs with Windows. So
Interesting.
that means you can present Ceph to a virtual machine, and they did some testing with it. And actually, the performance on a Windows Hyper-V machine was near native, near bare metal, so
Wow.
to speak, and better than Ubuntu, for example. So that was some interesting findings. Now, that said, it's always very geeky. It's a bit like PMEM, right? But I'm not seeing a lot of Cephs in my neck of the woods.
Same.
Uh, and the question is, well, what is it? Is it out of interest just for learning or geeking out, or do you happen to have so much Ceph deployments running around that you want to leverage it for your virtualization as well? It's a bit of a broad question, as you said. So,
Yeah.
but I can send you the link if you want to. You can always put it in the video with the native solution.
Yeah,
Not
definitely.
endorsing it, haven't used it. It's just something that I noticed this year that finally there is an easy to use solution available. Right?
Interesting. Yeah, if you want to send it over, I'll make sure that, hey, we get it put in the video description underneath this
Yeah.
video, right? So that way,
I'll
if you
put
guys
it
want
in
to check
the
it out.
chat already so I don't forget.
Hey, sounds
So
good.
that's the one about the fact that it is available, and these are the performance tests they did with it. So it's kind of cool.
Perfect. Very good. I'll make sure we get those in the show notes. moving on to the next question here. I wanted to. It's more kind of like a 101 related question, but it's an important it's an important topic area. We actually had somebody in the webinar kind of say, "Hey, I'm new to storage. I don't really know all the acronyms. Can you kind of explain all the acronyms?" And I mean, I was thinking about this after the webinar. I mean, you and I, we talk about storage. We mentioned S2D, Azure Stack HCI. We talk about all these acronyms, and I mean, it comes second nature to you and I because we've been living in this world, right? And I mean, for somebody, it kind of brought up the thought process for me, like for somebody who's just getting into IT and they're interested in storage, or maybe they're in a position where like, hey, I need to start putting some of this stuff in use. How do you get started really learning all of this storage knowledge, right? I mean, there's kind of a learning curve here that you and I, because we've been living it so long, we kind of take for granted, right? But I mean, for somebody getting started, sure. What are your thoughts on resources or techniques, or what can those people do to kind of get rolling?
Well, you're gonna have to spend time. That's inevitable, really. It's how do you get to Carnegie Hall, right? Practice, practice, practice.
Right.
So that's one. Then read a lot. Try to see the relationships, the links between technologies, and while you're doing that, you will learn a lot of acronyms and find out the explanations for them. Secondly, we used to be new to the industry, and every day there's new people coming into the industry, and we all have the same challenge. The challenge only gets bigger, right? There's ever more technology and it moves ever faster. So, but that's okay. You can't know anything, and we might laugh at a given moment if you get something wrong because it's funny, but that's never intended to make somebody feel stupid or lousy. It's just because it was a funny mistake. But you need to find people that are willing to explain and teach things to you.
Yep.
And if you have people that look down on you because you don't know it all, walk away.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
Wrong sort of people. You just have to have people that are willing to share and to grow together. And even today, we still have to learn a lot of new things, and we don't know it all either. And I know at the beginning of your career or job, your first job, it might look like an unsurmountable heap of knowledge, but just get going and stick with it, and you will learn. And sure, I must have sounded so stupid to so many people at the beginning.
I'm right there with you, my friend.
so I'm like, don't sweat that. I mean, that's just how it is.
That's
it's
all
like
part
going
of it.
to school, right? You can't read and do arithmetic. You're gonna have to learn it in the beginning. You're gonna do a lot of stupid things.
Yep.
And guess what? I still make spelling mistakes and I still make calculation mistakes.
Yep. Very true. Yeah, I could spend a whole hour talking about this particular topic here. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, you got to start somewhere. You got to walk before you can run, right? I mean, I remember, my first IT job, accidentally nuking an entire application share one time, right? Just completely shooting myself in the foot. So I mean, we've all been there. We've all been, the new guy in the room. We've all made mistakes. Just keep plugging along, and you'll get there eventually.
Yeah.
So
that's basically it.
Yes. And I will mention, I did successfully recover that application share from backup. Just saying. No permanent harm done. Anyway.
And hence you got interested in backups.
That's right. Always have a backup, because it saved my bacon. That was in the days of tape backup. So as I'm sitting there praying at the tape drive that the tapes are fine, as the restore is happening. But anyway, that's a whole story. Anyway, next question on the list here. Is centered around cloud storage. So we've talked a lot about on-premises storage as part of this webinar. And, the question came up like, hey, how does cloud storage fit into this whole story, And a couple things come to mind. I think the big one for me being like Azure Files. So if you're not aware of what Azure Files is, basically you can carve off a file share that lives in Microsoft Azure, the public Microsoft cloud service, and mount it inside of your environment somewhere. I think that's probably one of the more common cloud storage use cases that I've run into specifically. I think, Didier, you and I were actually talking about this earlier. You kind of have an interesting use case centered around Azure Files, don't you?
Oh yeah, I once used Azure Files to provide storage to, let's say, a legacy application that needed to get its data into the cloud, but we couldn't rewrite the application. So how would we do that? And basically, we took an Azure file share and even blogged about it. I just mounted it with a. Okay, now I'm lost, losing it again. With a help me.
The
Symbolic link.
symbolic
Yeah.
links, yeah.
With a symbolic link, right? And that made it transparent for the application. For the application, it was still the same folder on a volume, but actually that was a symbolic link going to the Azure file share.
And
so that doesn't work for every scenario, of course, due to performance reasons or whatever.
Right.
But it's one use case. Now, the biggest challenge you might have there is port 445, right?
Right.
A lot of ISPs, a lot of firewall and security people will find you and hunt you down if you even ask, let alone do it.
True.
Open that up over the firewall. Not that it can't be done securely, but of course it's a measure you will see. It's blocked by default, a bit like port 21, right?
Right.
That's just how it is, and hence that our people are looking at other solutions like Quick to access file shares over 443 with TLS, right, and mitigate that entire discussion. And sometimes, so that's one of the things. But on the other hand, the cloud storage question is very broad as well, because you have a slew of options if you do cloud native applications. Then you have the hybrid solutions, like, for example, with Azure File Sync, right?
Yep.
You can have your on-premises file servers with file shares, but actually the data lives in the cloud and you can sync it down in multiple locations. Yep. And another thing, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's one of my favorite technologies in Azure, honestly, is Azure File Sync, because, the way I always explain it is it's like, if I'm presenting this in front of a group of people, I'm always like, hey, you guys remember DFS? And everybody starts groaning, right? They're like, oh, DFS. And I'm like, it's like DFS, but it's really good.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing is that we were using it for some of the use cases was not as much. Microsoft likes to talk about the space savings, right? You're running out of storage. You don't have a budget. You don't want to buy. You just keep let's say the hot data downloaded on premises, and the rest is still available in the cloud.
Right.
But the use case for a lot of applications at our side was, look, we want to have applications use that data on premises, or even users. We also want applications in the cloud to use it, and they can use the REST APIs. But on the client side, some applications are legacy and they don't know that, so they can't use it. So that's one way around it. The thing that we are really very enthusiastic about is that Microsoft is integrating the ACLing support. It's in there. The ACLs are maintained, but how do you use them in Azure, right? You couldn't do Active Directory authentication against it. But that's in play now. So the scenarios are actually getting richer and more complete. So you can have both access in Azure, in a virtual machine, directly to the file shares, because ACLing is supported, but you can also use REST APIs. So whatever your use case is, it's all coming together, and that's kind of cool to see.
Yeah, it's definitely the technology is definitely maturing. It's good to see, like you said, and just all kinds of options for storage. So, well, Didier, I think we've pretty much wrapped up pretty much all the questions that we've got time for today. I think we covered everything that we didn't get to in the webinar. So, again, I want to thank you for taking the time to come and chat with us today and share your knowledge. You're always a wealth of knowledge whenever I have storage questions, so it's good to have you. Appreciate it again. And then yeah, definitely. And then those of you watching, appreciate you watching this follow-up video. If you didn't get a chance to actually watch the webinar that Didier and I have talked about a couple of times, that will also be in a link below this video. So you can certainly check that out. And also be sure to check out all the other content we have on the Altaro dojos. Again, altaro.com/dojo. We've got VMware content, Hyper-V content, Office 365 content, Azure content, MSP content if you're a service provider.
Security.
Yep, there's security stuff out there, so it's getting easier to say what don't we blog about rather than covering what we do. So, but anyway, hope you check that out. Other than that, have a great day, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.